Welcome to part 2 of this series on the economy. This is going to be about lesson 1. Lesson 1 as in lesson number 1, the number 1 lesson, the big thing you need to know. And what I'm going to do is deliver the lesson to you as it was told by Henry Hazlitt. This was a while ago. This was back in the 50s when he wrote his book Economics in One Lesson. You can read it online for free. I'm going to put a link over there so you can see it. But his lesson is, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. So in other words, when you have an economic policy, what you need to be looking at is not only what you intend to come from it or what you think is going to come from it, but also any side effects. And this is where you get into something very powerful called the law of unintended consequences. It's not really a law, kind of like Murphy's Law. Some people say doctrine of unintended consequences. Others say hidden costs or hidden effects or whatever. There's going to be other stuff that happens. It's kind of like if you take a medicine and it has the effect you want, but it also has all these side effects. Same kind of idea. The law of unintended consequences says that other things are going to be happening. So what are these other things? Well, let's just imagine this. Let's imagine that you're driving down the road and there's a place on the road where there's kind of a ditch with a drop-off, and that makes you nervous. And you think, gee, the government should put up a barrier there. And then the government does put up a barrier, and then you drive by again, and the barrier's there. Now think about how you drive now that the barrier's there, as opposed to how you drove before the barrier came up. You drive pretty differently. Without the barrier, you were more cautious. Maybe you slowed down, maybe you were more alert. You really didn't want to go off the edge. With the barrier there was a lulling effect. You said, oh, I'm safer. Maybe not consciously, but it's like, oh, I'm safer, so you relaxed and went through it. But what that meant is that before the barrier, you were driving more safely. That means you were less likely to get in an accident than you are now. Now, that makes sense because the consequences are different. You don't have the consequence of going into the gully. But it only makes sense if the consequences are commensurate with your reaction to it. If you're overestimating the value of the barrier, then what you're doing is you're being less cautious than you should be, and overall, the effect of the barrier might actually be that there are more accidents. Now, I'm not saying barriers are bad. I'm just saying every time you do something like this, you have to take this into effect. When you say, is a barrier going to be effective, you have to consider not only the consequences of having the accident, but the consequences on the psychology of the drivers. You've got to consider them all and figure out which way wins out in the end. That's the essence of the law of unintended consequences, and if you want to learn more about that particular effect, look up the Peltzman Effect. Now, the premier example in economics of this is something raised by Frederick Bastiat back in the 19th century, and Hazlitt wrote about it in his book. It's called the broken window fallacy. And it goes like this. A shop owner has a store with a plate glass window. A boy comes along, throws a rock, and breaks out the window. Angry, the shop owner runs out and starts yelling at the boy, and it attracts a crowd. The crowd gets to thinking, why is he so mad at the boy? The boy has done something good, because now a glazier has work. Someone has to make a new pane of glass, and there are also jobs for workmen who have to install the new pane of glass, and that increases the local economy. That's good for everyone. Don't be so selfish just because your window's broken. This is going to improve things for everyone. Well, this is a fallacy, and it's a fallacy for the reasons why I just said. They're thinking, oh, now a glazier has work. But he has work because a window has been broken. What if that window hadn't been broken? Let's say it costs $200 to replace the window. Well, what would the store owner have done with that $200 if the boy hadn't broken the window? Let's say he would have used it to buy a new suit. So what happens is he can't buy the suit anymore because he was going to use that money to buy the suit. Now he has to use it to pay for the new window. So the glazier's job comes at the cost of the tailor's job. But you never see that. You never see the lost suit. You never see what would have been done with the money. We can actually show this mathematically. Let's look at the value of a new window minus the value of the broken window. That is greater than the value of the new suit. That is why the business owner is going to spend the money to fix the window and decide not to get the new suit after all. The broken window might actually have a negative value because it lets in flies and messes with the air conditioning and everything. So that's not a good thing. So he wants his window fixed. That's how the crowd's thinking. But what they're not doing is they're not considering the value of the new window versus the value of the old but unbroken window. If we do that, we see that the value of the new window minus the value of the old but unbroken window is less than the value of the new suit. Now you can make the argument that when he puts in a new window, he's going to put in a better window. Maybe it'll be better insulated, maybe it'll be soundproof or whatever, it'll be a better window. It doesn't matter. If he had thought that those improvements were worth it, if the value of having the new window was that great, he would have replaced his window without it having to be broken. And this is a big thing that people just don't get. One example is back at the end of 2004, we had the Asian tsunami. It killed over 300,000 people. But there were a lot of pundits, usually from places that weren't affected by the tsunami, and they said that, well, there's going to be an economic benefit from this because all of the infrastructure is going to have to be rebuilt. When it's rebuilt, it's made better, and so the tsunami's a good thing. Well, okay, let's forgive the fact, as disgusting as it is to do so, let's forgive the fact that they're ignoring 300,000 lost lives. You can't really say that the new infrastructure is worth more than the old, given the costs they've had to incur. How many cities make improvements by evacuating everyone and then bombing themselves? They don't do it because it's not worth it. This is the broken window fallacy. Now, in the parable of the broken window, everyone has different things, like in any parable, that they represent. And what happens is the crowd represents the people and the boy represents the government. And so what happens is the government has come along and smashed a window and says, hey, look, I'm making jobs. And people say, hey, yay, I'm making jobs. And the poor shop owner's out a new suit, which of course no one ever sees. And we'll see this, for example, when we get into talk about minimum wage. Minimum wage will have some people working for the new minimum wage, and they'll be thinking, hey, great, I'm making the new minimum wage and not the old one. What you don't see is the people who lose their jobs because of the minimum wage, because that's harder to see. And this is true with all sorts of stuff. We'll see it in more detail when we cover that in the future video. So when you're considering these things, think about the unintended consequences.